Hello and welcome to the Expert Voice. European Union and Turkey have recently signed an agreement aimed at controlling the mass movement of people in Europe. To learn more about this agreement, we have invited Dr. Amanda Garrett, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Georgetown University in Qatar and a specialist in international migration and immigration in Europe. Dr. Garrett, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Dr. Garrett, could you please tell us what the agreement is between EU and Turkey?
Sure. The current agreement between the European Union and Turkey is really a turning point in the European Union's attempt to manage the refugee crisis. Most of these refugees are coming from war-torn areas, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Europe hasn't really faced a refugee crisis of this magnitude since the Second World War. So logistically and politically, it's presenting a lot of difficulties. The challenge isn't just the influx of refugees, but it's also the sort of disproportionate burden that some countries are facing. Countries like Germany, Greece, Italy, they're taking in much larger numbers of refugees than other countries that have closed their borders or built fences. So the European Union really tried at first to kind of redistribute refugees amongst the nation states, but the deal with Turkey represents a different kind of policy. They're trying to stem the tide of refugees, the initial influx of refugees. They're trying to slow it down or to control it, perhaps in an attempt to buy some time for the European Union. So the deal stipulates that any migrant coming from Turkey to Europe, specifically Greece, through a clandestine route will be sent back to Turkey. And it's really aimed at targeting those who are taking the route via the Aegean Sea and doing it through unconventional or uncontrolled channels. And there's also kind of a one-in, one-out policy specifically for Syrian refugees. So for every Syrian refugee that Europe sends back to Turkey, the European Union has agreed to take one Syrian asylum seeker and give them a home in Europe.
And why is this deal between EU and Turkey so controversial?
I think this deal is controversial for a number of reasons. The biggest one is that we're not even really sure that the deal is legal. It may violate some dimensions of international law, specifically the United Nations Convention on Refugees. This convention states that refugees have to be evaluated on an individual basis, so any attempt to apply a blanket policy could be a violation, and we're specifically worried about whether there'll be collective deportations as a result of this policy. We also know that refugees should be sent back to safe countries, and some human rights organizations have expressed doubt as to whether Turkey should be considered a safe country. There are also some ethical concerns with this policy, so if the route via the Aegean Sea is closed, many migrants may just look for alternative routes. They may look to go from North Africa or from Libya to Southern Europe and Italy, and we know that this Mediterranean route is very dangerous and deadly. So there's some potential moral qualms with the policy as well.
Thank you for that. How successful do you think this agreement is likely to be?
I think the success of the deal is going to be determined in the short term by how likely it is to deter migrants from making the initial trip to Europe. It's probably going to be less successful in terms of enforcing the deal for those migrants that have already come or who plan to come to Europe. This is primarily because Greece, which is the main recipient country, doesn't really have the infrastructure, the resources, the finances, or the manpower to enforce it on their own. They're struggling already with a huge backlog of refugees sitting in refugee camps whose papers they're trying to process, and they simply don't have the resources to do this by themselves without some kind of massive help from the European Union. I think also we should be looking in the next couple of weeks or months to see what the political fallout from this is going to be. There's a lot of pressure from the international community, from human rights organizations, and even from domestic actors, particularly in Germany, who are staunchly opposed to this. So how well these countries are able to kind of weather the political backlash will also determine how tenable or how successful the policy can be.
Dr. Garrett, thank you very much for joining us. This has been the Expert Voice, brought to you by Georgetown University in Qatar.